I would be concerned and worried if I were you, so welcome to Newsnight.
Good evening and thank you for having us. Certainly we are concerned, like any other South African, at the impact of the rolling load shedding on the normal life of citizens, but also on the elections itself. We are engaged with the team from Eskom to firstly understand the causes of load shedding, but more importantly to anticipate its impact on voting day processes, and more importantly to have contingency measures that will ensure that even on election day, in the unlikely event that load shedding occurs, we can still issue a result at each of the voting stations.
What kind of contingency plans has Eskom come out to you and communicated as being put in place? Because from what I understand, the contingency plan in itself is said to be an expensive exercise because we're expecting load shedding for the next 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, as per Eskom's communication. So when you're saying contingency plan, exactly what have they told you that they're going to be that is going to be in place ahead of those elections and on voting day specifically?
The first prize from an Eskom perspective is to stabilize the grid, not only for the election, but for the economy and for certainly for the South African public. On our part, we're activating our second-tier contingency plan. You'll recall that voting happens from 7 a.m. in the morning until 9 p.m. in the evening. So before dusk, there is no challenge to the electoral process because our voting process is 100% manually based on paper. The challenge comes after dark, where we are rolling out lighting, whether it's solar-powered light or generators, to support all of our voting stations. Similarly, we're looking at also backup generators to support our result capturing infrastructure so that we can issue results still in the shortest possible time.
But then when you're saying that so that you can still issue out results in the shortest possible time, so that means that there is room for error and there's room for, because also you're going to be relying on human interests here and human participation, in the sense that, let's be specific, let's say that you choose one particular voting station, right, in the Eastern Cape in some rural part, and it's now 7:30 in the evening. Voting happens on May 8th, which means that it's going to be definitely dark by 7:30 in the evening. People are still walking in, but there's not power that has been communicated or even dropped off at that particular voting station. That in itself means that there's room for theft of the ballot boxes being stolen. There's room for just in the entire electoral process being absolutely compromised simply because of that contingency plan failing. So in that instance, what do you have in place to ensure that that doesn't happen? And let's be honest, we live in a country where things like this can happen. We saw the last elections where libraries being burnt down. So what makes us think that we won't have a situation where a light does not actually reach a voting station and therefore compromising the freeness and the fairness of the electoral process?
Our first-tier support of contingency was targeted at only those voting stations at which we do not have connection to the grid or those voting stations that are of a temporary nature. What we are doing now, we're looking at a fast-track procurement mechanism to ensure that we can provide at least a source of lighting at all of our 30,000 voting stations as a matter of course.
So then this is the procurement process, right? Now it's a normal, so if a public procurement process or any form of procurement process needs to go through the due diligence. So going through the diligence takes time. You and I both know this, it takes time. So how much time has been allocated for the due diligence, number one? And number two, when those individuals come forward and they say they can supply power to the various stations, how are you going to ensure that on that day the power gets them? You and I don't want to find ourselves in a situation where it's one thing for Johannesburg, it's another thing for Gauteng province, but go to the Free State, go to rural Eastern Cape, go to Mpumalanga, we're talking a different story altogether. People that want to participate in the electoral process but can't.
Sure. The first prize would be to have a stable grid. On top of that, we're providing a first-tier contingency plans, but as I speak, we're activating a second tier, which includes providing a source of lighting to each of our voting stations.
By procurement, right?
It has to be a procurement process.
How long is that process going to take?
There are processes to short-circuit the procurement process if you can prove that there's an emergency. And this constitutes an emergency, and we do not anticipate that Treasury will not look favorably on our request to do a short-circuited procurement process.
So then that short-circuited procurement process, you're guaranteeing that it's also the due diligence is going to be done. In other words, Masego, what I'm getting to is that so that we don't have friends Faith's friend from around the corner who happens to know somebody who's connected to whatever getting the actual procurement deal, that it's actually going to be based on people who know what they're doing, who are able to survive and capacitate you guys especially with the requirements that you have, so that you don't find yourselves having to explain what happened. My problem is that we're finding ourselves explaining what happened and what went wrong too often in this country. So are you going to ensure that the due diligence, in other words, the person's getting it because they are capacitated, because they can supply the various requirements that you have, and also that they can deliver rightly on the day?
Sure, and it will be a combination of outsourcing this service, but also...
And it's not going to be Faith's friend from around the corner who happens to know somebody within who's got a leeway of getting that deal because that deal is worth an X amount of money.
Even in the short-circuited process, we will comply with the prescripts of the law. We will ensure the South African population that there will be a source of lighting at each of the voting stations, and that even if we are challenged after dark, we can still continue the voting process and the counting process in conditions of relative safety, and we can ensure the safe counting of all the ballots cast at each and every voting.
You're the IC, right? Why can't you go to Eskom and say, listen, guys, you're going to compromise, because the world is going to be watching South Africa during that day, particularly, as the world does every single voting time. So why can't you put pressure on Eskom and say, can we just have a day or 2 or 3 that the power does not go off, that the grid is actually stabilized, so that this electoral process does not get compromised in any way? Because if anything happens, if a ballot paper gets stolen because of this, because some criminal activity has managed to creep in during the darkness. We say this, but the fact is, this is what happens. Some criminal activity happens, you know it's going to be news for the next coming 2 weeks. So what pressure can you put on Eskom to make sure that the lights are on during that time?
Eskom is already seized with the responsibility, and I don't think they need any pressure from anyone else to make sure that they put the grid is operational. I don't think there's any need to put more pressure on Eskom. They assist with the responsibility. We're working together with them. It is in their interest, it's in the interest of the country that we get the grid correct.
All right, well, Masego, I think on the day, I know that you're definitely going to have a lot of eyes on you, so we hope that everything will go run smoothly, and those individuals that need to be, or those companies that need to procure the right materials and the capacity, are able to do so freely and fairly. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, we've got there the Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Masego Shiburu, giving us the latest in terms of what can we anticipate on voting day.